Mr. President, dear colleagues and friends, the guideline of our host Corona, the 4 quadrants of exchange, provides an interesting challenge. It may be evident that exchange could take place across long distances between personal acquaintances by means of the bill of exchange as the most important medium of cashless payment transactions, or through simple prescription in the merchant banker's books. The encompassing system of cashless payment transactions in Europe and beyond, as well as the classical prescription of the exchange banks of Venice, Amsterdam, Hamburg, and Nuremberg, provides sufficient proof. But what are the relations between the above-mentioned distant and proximate exchanges if both forms of cashless payment cannot be separated after all? The mere fact that exchange banks were essentially founded to re-provide financial centers with some regulating structure for geographically widespread cashless payments based on bill of exchange showed that there existed a closer relationship between the quadrants 2 and 3 than only a fuzzy distinction. In the following contribution, I will investigate what kind of closer relationship this was or may have been. First, let us look at the realm of bookkeeping, which, according to the program, is emphasized only in this contribution. Simple bookkeeping, which had been common since antiquity, served to document closed business transactions for the memory of the trader himself and as proof against hostilities in court. Indeed, according to the Roman Corpus Juris Civilis, the merchant's accounts had to be made public in the case of disputes in court. Within Latin Christianity, during the commercial revolution since the late 12th century, such type of documentation became particularly important in light of the spatial, quantitative, and personal expansion of business transactions, before all of northern Italian and Tuscan merchants, which made a more precise control over single transactions necessary. In commercial companies in particular, bookkeeping made it possible to control the different factors effectively and to attribute the company assets to each investor or partner within the company individually. A decisive criterion for keeping these books was their evidential value in court. The latter, however, was independent from the way in which these books were kept in single partnerships or trading companies. Single business transactions were chronologically written down at best, as a rule without observing a specific structure. After these rather unstructured notes, the next step involved the use of a comparison or the keeping of accounts. A further innovation in bookkeeping techniques, which became more and more important in the 14th century, was the occasional offsetting of different accounts or entries, because partnership agreements usually had a limited duration of only a few years. Consequently, with each prolongation, accounts had to be settled. In the second step, we come to cashless payment transactions based on bills of exchange. The bill of exchange, which built on ancient forerunners, was developed in Italy during the Commercial Revolution. In its classical form, which had existed since the 14th century, it depicted a payment order which was used by the issuer or drawer to give the drawee in another place the task of settling a debt in his name to be beneficiary or presenter. Previously, the issuer had already given the bill in exchange for money to the remitter or deliverer, who forwarded it to the presenter. The basis for bill of exchange transactions constitutes the permutatio pecunia absentis cum presenti and the distantia or differentia loci, which is the change of currency due to different currencies and the different locations of the 3 or 4 business partners, which manifested itself in the exchange rate. The bill of exchange functioned as a safe means of transferring money, as a means of payment and credit in trade, as a source of credit in money lending, and as a means to exploit different exchange rates in different places. Taking this basic model of a bill of exchange transactions as a starting point of further considerations, the requirement of bookkeeping for bill of exchange transactions becomes especially clear in one area. Because the remitter and the presenter stood in liability of current account, and the presenter had to credit the remittant with the amount received from the drawee or acceptant, bookkeeping was absolutely required. Theoretically, the drawer or issuer, as well as the drawee or acceptant, could do without bookkeeping, because they both received or spent hard currency, after which the transactions was settled for them, but whether this would be efficient business practice remains an open question. Because of their current account relationship, however, the remitter and presenter were forced to keep their positions spent or received in writing to avoid losing control over their business. Even if the remitter and presenter were one single person or enterprise who exercised all banking functions, the written fixation of the different positions seemed an obvious way to get an overview of the payment made and received. In principle, it has to be maintained that bills of exchange transactions make the merchant's life more complicated than before. Although this innovation enabled them to provide or receive liquidity at any place within its network of business relations, a significantly more time-consuming arithmetic was the price he had to pay for it. Instead of the ability to add and subtract, which still had been sufficient for the traveling long-distance merchant prior to the 12th century, the merchant now had to master all 4 fundamental rules of arithmetic. Otherwise, he would neither be able to understand the conversion of one sum into a different currency based on an exchange rate, nor the actual financial revenue of a bills of exchange transaction. It may be assumed that many merchants have failed because of their flawed arithmetic capabilities. Is it really a coincidence that precisely in the late 12th century, the number and significance of bill of exchange transactions in the Mediterranean increased, while at the same time, the Indian Arab numbers, including 0, were spread throughout the Western Mediterranean? The latter were spread from Spain, from Toledo, by means of Latin translations of the Arab mathematical works of the Khwarezmic polymath Al-Khwarizmi, and from Italy by Leonardo Fibonacci, with a arithmetician from Pisa. Fibonacci's central work, the Liber Abaci of 1202, devotes several chapters to multiplication and division based on Indian Arab numbers. But before all else, in chapter 8, De Emptione and Vendizione Rerum Venalium et Similium, it deals with the rules of 3 and the conversion of currencies, weights and measures, and thus with one of the central arithmetic foundations of bills of exchange transactions. The latter's volume and geographical scope increased for a reason since the 13th century. Thanks to the application of Indian Arab numbers, the arithmetical skills of merchants had significantly improved and became much easier compared to calculations with Roman numbers. Although many early bills of exchange contained quantities in Roman numbers, that is not a contradiction. The preceding calculation could have been executed with Indian Arab numbers, whereas the official document, the bill of exchange, was issued in Roman numbers for reasons of tradition as well as to secure its validity in court. Precisely the issue of zero encouraged the curia as well as many merchants to continue such practice until late in the 14th and partially even until the 15th century. For contemporaries at the court and the courts saw the zero, which was represented with a small dot in the Middle Ages, as easy to falsify and suspicious because it symbolized nothingness. Although the use of Indian Arab numbers could significantly increase the arithmetic capabilities of merchants, it remained important to control whether the calculations were right or not. The verification of correct calculations, payments, and bill of exchange transactions, when needed, including other conversions of the currencies used in the bill of exchange, posed much larger problems than they had ever been in times of cash payments. Recent research on bookkeeping, most importantly by Baselas Jamie, Federico Melis, and in Germany Dieter Schneider, sees the necessity to control merchants' bills as a decisive impetus for the establishment of early forms of double-entry bookkeeping based on previous simple bookkeeping techniques during the Italian commercial revolution of the late Middle Ages. For in contrast with simple bookkeeping, double-entry bookkeeping made the exact arithmetic control of entries possible, because all external transactions as well as all internal inventory changes were credited on two different accounts of one general ledger. One account on the debit side, the left, and one of the credit side, the right. Both entries register at the same amount, but differentiate them with the different signs, debit and credit. Consequently, the sum of all debit entries had to correspond with the sum of all credit entries. Or, as Dieter Schneider has emphasized, the goal of double entries is of purely arithmetical nature, the control of arithmetic capabilities. Therefore, the development of double entry bookkeeping is a technical improvement which is not as important as the invention of the steam engine, but more important than that of the personal computer. So, Dieter Schneider. In this way, recent research on bookkeeping sees the control function as the decisive innovation in 14th century bookkeeping techniques, whereas elder research of Max Weber and Werner Sombart has put its significance for the rise of capitalist structure in the center. In this context, a temporal relation can be observed between the development of double-entry bookkeeping and the change from the traveling long-distance merchant to the resident wholesale merchant during the commercial revolution. The eldest account books based on double-entry bookkeeping originate from Florence around 1300, but their emergence occurred simultaneously and independently in different Italian cities. From there, in the course of several decades and centuries, the manifold business contracts of Italian merchants triggered its distribution across the entire Latin Christianity. The coincidence of this development with the increasing asceticism of merchants is hardly surprising, for whereas the traveling long-distance merchant was able to control his business directly at the places covered in his travels, the resident wholesale merchant had to control geographically widespread transactions like a spider in a web. He had to rely on the exact evaluation of the information provided to him, such as payment entries, sale proceeds, transport costs, etc. He needed a written overview of all his transactions with a correct calculation of all entries, regardless of the form of the incoming and outgoing amounts. If used properly, the double-entry bookkeeping techniques that became more and more elaborate in Italy during the 14th century met these requirements. The geographical expansion of trade and cashless payment transactions, the pressure of their more stringent control, and the increasing necessity to verify correct calculations and conversions resulting from them led to an increasingly strong mutual promotion of exchange transactions and double-entry arithmetically verifiable bookkeeping since the 14th century, even if a fully fledged double-entry bookkeeping alla veneziana was not always necessary. Companies that largely did without bills of exchange transactions and used corporate prescriptions instead did not need double-entry bookkeeping. The prime example for the latter is the intercontinentally active Vereinigte Ostindische Kompanie, the VOC, worldwide one of the largest enterprises of its time, which executed cashless payment transactions using corporate assignatses rather than bills of exchange, including currency conversion. Simple bookkeeping was sufficient for the entry of such assignatses. Contrastingly, the individual entrepreneur in southern German high finance around the mid-16th century necessarily had to rely on double-entry bookkeeping if he engaged on the European capital markets with complex bills of exchange transactions in royal finance, as it had been shown recently in the example of Paulus Beheim of Nuremberg. The more voluminous the bills of exchange operations, the more important became an elaborated system of bookkeeping. This was the case when the canonically controversial Ricorsa bill was used, like at the fairs of Lyons before the Grand Parti. The background of this connection is that only the relatively regular offsetting of single accounts made the calculation of arbitrage profits and hidden interests possible. Said differently, without the use of double-entry bookkeeping, a banker engaged in royal finance did not exactly know where his capital was located and how much profit it brought him. The more complex and geographically extended the bills of exchange operations became, the higher became the requirements of bookkeeping. This becomes particularly clear with the gradual expansion of the endorsement since the late 16th and before all during the 17th century, starting in Flanders and the Netherlands. Endorsement refers to a remark written on the back, indosso or indorso, of a bill of exchange, which authorized a person that had not been involved in the bills of exchange transaction so far to present the bill. By means of the endorsement, the claim deduced from the bill was transferred to someone else, which was confirmed in the signature indosso. Through the use of the endorsement, the bill of exchange could be circulated and turned into paper money for merchants. This meant that the bill was no longer passed on directly from the remitter to the originally envisaged presenter, and from there to the troyee, but that a relatively large number of endorsements could be put in between. Through a continuous series of endorsements, which must be attributable to the issuers of the document, the last endorsee, as rightful owner of the bill of exchange, could legitimize to be paid by the issuer or debtor of the bill. As a rule, The transmission of such endorsed bills of exchange occurred after the deduction of a discount. In this way, the purchase of a bill of exchange could usually result in a profitable business transaction. It had been proved for bookkeeping in the 18th century that this development resulted in drawing up special bills of exchange copybooks. Special bills of exchange books with exclusively registered bills of exchange transactions had existed before that time as part of the individual business practices of single entrepreneurs. Bills of exchange copybooks, however, were lists of the bills of exchange passing through a company, which included the names of all endorsers and endorsees, so that the exact itinerary of this bill of exchange across all its previous stations could be traced until its arrival at the registering company. Such registration seemed necessarily to be able to trace back the itinerary in the bill in case of a liability issue when the bill was not paid. Such bills of exchange copybooks, or parts of them, are available for merchant bankers of all kinds since the 18th century. Among them, there were smaller merchant bankers as well, which participated intensively in international cashless payment transactions, as, for example, the Amman in Schaffhausen. Finally, we should ask about the significance of cashless payment transactions and double-entry bookkeeping for the emerging world economy, or at least for its preform, the global trade. Four aspects deserve our attention. First, together with the intercontinental flows of precious metals, cashless payment transactions made it possible for Europeans and non-Europeans to finance overseas trade and to establish overseas production sites. Second, the development of world trade and the emerging world economy were, so to say, pulled through a financial network. Third, in the 19th century at the latest, cashless payment transactions between the continents were safer than the transfer of precious metals, as might already have been the case in the late Middle Ages for large parts of southern and western Europe. There is no doubt that this safety, which especially during the final decades of the 19th century was supported by an increasingly dense European-based network of overseas banks, promoted economic exchange between countries and continents, and thus contributed significantly to the development of the world economy. Fourth and last, whereas until late in the 19th century a long-distance payment with precious metals essentially took as long as a bill of exchange payment, because both means of payment had to be transported by ship or over land across the same distance, electric telegraphy made it possible to execute payment orders or transfers between geographically distant world regions within the shortest period of time. Reactions on exchange rate fluctuations on bills of exchange markets became a matter of hours and minutes during the era of the telegraph, and this, if necessary, on a global scale. The faster and more reliable communication became, the shorter also became the most common usances in cashless payment transactions, a development with which the transportation of precious metals could not keep up by any means. The central significance of cashless payment transactions for the establishment of a globally linked world economy based on the division of labor and had its fundament also and precisely in double-entry bookkeeping, which made the mutual settlement of incoming payments and debits sufficiently transparent and verifiable. The close connection between cashless payment transactions and the double-entry bookkeeping, which becomes apparent from sources of entrepreneurial history in Western and Central Europe, becomes even clearer if other affluent economic regions are observed. India, China, Japan, and the Islamic world did not know some forms of cashless payment transactions, did know some forms of cashless payment transactions, but they were not nearly as elaborated as the European system of bills of exchange, which not only comprised a transfer of liquidity, but also a change of currency, if necessary, complemented with a return bill or endorsement. And these countries did know simple but not double entry bookkeeping. Simply put, the former is due to the relative unity of currency in a large economic space, which made changes of currency unnecessary. Consequently, bookkeeping did not need a complex double entry system because there were no complex cashless payment transactions. Thus, the connection between elaborated, complex system of cashless payment transactions and bookkeeping, which is so typical for the European system of trade and economy, was unique in the pre- and early industrial world and constituted a cornerstone for the exceptional role and significance of European merchant bankers in the development of world trade and the world economy based on the division of labor. Thank you very much.